I am Liz Marquardt, and I'm from Sojourner Family Center. We call the agency Sojourner. I prefer not to hear it shortened to Sojo, although I know lots of folks do that. The Family Peace Center is the building on 6th and Walnut where we have 14 co-located partners, including Sojourner. I'll talk about that later. So I know the title gets a little confusing, but our formal legal title is Sojourner Family Peace Center, but I'm just going to talk about us as Sojourner when I get to that, and the Family Peace Center as the building with the co-located partners. Okay. So we're going to define domestic abuse. We're going to talk about how to respond to disclosures of abuse. We're going to talk about the rich array of Milwaukee options for support for survivors and for those who cause harm. We are going to take a little virtual tour of Sojourner at the Family Peace Center. So if we were there in person, we'd walk around, but you're actually going to see spaces that are private that we wouldn't show during an in-person tour. So we are going to focus today on those experiencing abuse. I know that in your practice that you also see those who are causing the harm to the survivors. As a community, we really need to provide care for the entire family if we want violence to end. Because in order to increase safety, everyone in the family needs to have their needs met. We are very concerned about the rise in homicides, and we have seen that the rise in homicides are not just intimate partner violence homicides, but also have included family members. There was an uncle-nephew situation recently. There's been siblings. There's been children who've tried to intervene. There's also bystanders, a neighbor who tried to stop someone from being abused who was killed during trying to intervene. So we know that the violence in families spills over, and that it happens in households and families as well as intimate partner relationships. And we want to pay attention to all of that, and we want to think about the messaging. I am going to be very careful about my language. I'm not going to talk about survivors as female and those who cause harm as male, although that is the typical statistically. I don't want to make invisible those folks in same-sex relationships or male survivors. And I'm also going to try really hard not to call the folks in the relationship where there's abuse victims and abusers, because I don't particularly care for those labels. I'm going to talk about survivors, and I'm going to talk about those causing harm. And we also know that historically, those who are perpetrating the violence are very, very likely to have been victims of violence themselves in their history, that hurt people. We know this to be true. It's not an excuse, it's just context for understanding the dynamic. And that we as a community need to understand all of that. So this is where we would be if we were in person. The top picture is the public entrance to Sojourner and the Family Peace Center. There is a statue of Sojourner Truth herself in honor of our namesake. The bottom picture is the private entrance to the emergency shelter, the emergency domestic violence shelter that we run. Only staff, volunteers, and residents use this side of the building. We also have underground parking so that someone who's staying in the shelter doesn't need to park in a place where their car could be seen from the road. And we've got security, we've got double lock doors, we've got lots of things to make folks safe while they're in the building. So when we're talking about domestic violence, we're going to talk about a pattern of behavior, not a single incident. We think about it in terms of both adults and adolescents in relationships that use this. And as I said, besides intimate partner relationships, we're also going to think about family relationships and household relationships. And we're going to think about the harm that it causes. We believe in the model that was developed in Duluth by Michael Paymar and Ellen Pence, that power and control is the purpose, or at least the result, of abusive tactics, and that physical and sexual violence holds it all together, but there's lots of different ways of being abusive in a relationship. And I already talked about family and household relationships. So this is the Duluth model developed by Michael Paymar and Ellen Pence. What they did is they went around to groups of Back then it was groups of women and groups of men, most of whom had been ordered because of their involvement in the criminal legal system to go to a group. And they talked about what were the tactics that were happening in the relationship. And the women, the survivors, told Michael and Ellen that the result of these tactics was that their partner had all the power and control in the relationship, and that it diminished their self-efficacy. It diminished their ability to make decisions without considering how their partner was going to react. And they visualized it as a wheel because they believed that each of those tactics was a spoke that made it stronger, and that physical and sexual violence sort of held the whole thing together. So if my partner is emotionally abusive but has never been physically violent, there's a different meaning than if there's been violence in our history, and that those two things interplay and strengthen each other. When they created the power control wheel, there were lots of tactics that were discussed that didn't make it onto the wheel. They said if a tactic came up in every single group, that it was going to be on the wheel, but there's lots and lots of tactics that aren't on the wheel. So we have since become very, very acutely aware of stalking, of strangulation, of pet abuse, and also it's a very specific way of denying, minimizing, and blaming, which is the lower right corner. It's at about 5 to 6 o'clock. Minimizing, denying, and blaming is saying it wasn't so bad, and if it really, or it didn't happen, and if it really did happen, it was your fault anyways. But there's a very specific way of minimizing, denying, and blaming where the person who's causing the harm actually claims to be the victim of the person they're harming. So flipping the script is a very, very common tactic of those who are causing harm. So I think that most of you have probably seen this wheel. And by the way, I am going to share the presentation and some resources with Claire to distribute to the whole group, so you don't need to furiously take notes or take pictures or screenshots of the presentation. So when we think about the ways that those causing harm get power and control in the relationship, besides the physical and sexual violence, we're also talking about, starting at 12 o'clock, using intimidation. So that intimidation makes more sense in the context of historical violence. Emotional abuse gives someone lots of control. Using isolation ensures that the survivor doesn't have access to their regular support, their natural supports, and it also gives more power to the person causing the harm, because it strengthens that relationship when the other relationships are severed or weak. I already talked about minimizing, denying, and blaming. Using children and making the survivor feel like they're a bad parent, or that they may lose their children, or very, very specifically, like, I will hurt the children or take the children if you don't do what I want you to do. Using privilege comes in more flavors than just using male privilege. It can be using social and economic privilege. It can be using race privilege. It can be using heteronormative privilege. Lots of ways that plays out. At the time the wheel was created, it was really about sexism and male privilege. And it's also true that those causing the harm often have a very inflated sense of entitlement. Like, I have a right to be in control, and I have a right to all the power in the relationship. Using economic abuse, we could talk about literally for days, because the impact of that can be far reaching, and it's a powerful tool to keep someone dependent on you for meeting their basic needs, and impacting credit, savings, all kinds of peripheral effects on economic abuse. And then, of course, using coercion and threats. And the threats aren't always to harm physically, but they can be. And just basically saying, if you don't do what I want, or if you separate from me, bad things are going to happen. So the question, the $10,000 question that always comes up during a presentation is, gosh, if all that stuff is happening, why doesn't the person being harmed leave the relationship? And that is a complicated question, but I really believe that there are two sides to that coin. And one is fear that things will be worse if I don't comply, and hope that I can make it better, right? So fear that something bad will happen and hope that something good will happen. I think that very, very frequently survivors have a choice between staying, which carries some risk, or leaving, which also carries different kinds of risks. So very often survivors are between a rock and a hard place. Either I stay and I'm being harmed by the person that I'm in the relationship with, or I leave and maybe I'm not believed. Maybe the danger to me escalates. Maybe my kids are at risk. Maybe I face legal repercussions. And if all of my support and all of my social network is tied up with the person who's harming me, if I leave that person, I may not have that social support. So I'm not going to read slides to you. You can see what the barriers are. And like I said, very, very frequently there's an emotional component where I'm invested in the relationship. I want the relationship to continue. I have feelings for this person. I've invested time and energy, and I want the relationship to continue, even though I want the abuse to stop. And very, very frequently, the partner is using that in a manipulative way and making promises to change and saying that they're going to get help, they're going to get treatment, they're going to stop drinking, they're going to go to therapy, whatever the case may be. The partner is perhaps sincere, but also perhaps manipulating the survivor in the relationship into staying and hoping. So lots of folks talk about this as a cycle, and that after the abuse, there's very, very frequently a honeymoon phase where the person causing the harm is making promises, treating the survivor well, and making them hope that that is the relationship in the future. So then when you layer upon it additional barriers that folks experience, not just in the relationship, but sort of life-generated risks, whether it is their legal status in the country or a relationship that they don't necessarily want to be public about, especially if they're not out. Someone who's LGBT or Q may not want the relationship to be publicized. If perhaps the survivor is a teenager dating someone that their family does not approve of, then that's another reason to keep the relationship secret. And then there's also power imbalances between the survivor and the person who's causing them harm. If the abuser is a police officer or a veteran or in the military, an elected official, a business owner, something that gives them more credibility or more power in the relationship, or the survivor has an identity or has engaged in behavior that makes them less credible or less valued in our society. And then there's the complicating factor of alcohol and street drugs and substance use disorders, and how that plays out in a relationship where there's abuse, which again, we could talk about that piece all day as well. So can we talk a minute? Let's have a quick discussion about the intersection of housing insecurity and domestic violence and other issues. That came up quite a bit in the survey that Claire sent out. What are the intersections? How does this play out in your practice? You can answer in the chat, or you can raise your hand, or just unmute yourself and contribute. What's the intersection between the work that we do as a COC and domestic abuse?
Liz, we have a situation where we have a client who's separate from her husband in shelters, but he is controlling all the financial information. So he won't sit down with our case managers to talk about housing or what their finances are or anything. She's kind of afraid to like do anything that he says isn't kosher. So it's just really tough. She's a sweet woman, but it's a very tough situation because she's so financially dependent upon him for housing, and he will not reveal anything.
Thanks, Lori. So it's not just that she's financially dependent on him, but also that he's controlling all the information about their finances, right?
Yeah.
So it's got a couple of layers there. Wendy's saying in the chat, individuals become housing insecure due to a client that has left the situation but continues to show up and damage the unit, so putting housing at risk. So very, very frequently, we see lots of evictions on someone's history. And sometimes that's the result of poverty, and sometimes that's a result of actions, actively, the person causing the harm doing things that have a negative impact on the survivor. Erica said sometimes an inside situation is more dangerous than an outside situation due to violence and abuse. This factors into prioritization, assessment, and referral. Absolutely. I have heard so many survivors say that I'm suffering from lots of negative things that have happened because I left the person who was harming me, but I still feel so much freer than I was when I was living with the person who was harming me. Deanna said, I work with members in our HMO, Medicaid, United Healthcare. One situation is that it's difficult to be ready when they are ready. Often they seem ready to go and then they do not. So we need to be ready whenever they are. That's a really important point, that change is not linear, right? People making decisions, they may be ready, and then when you're ready, they're not. It is sort of a 3 steps forward, 2 steps back situation sometimes. And we also need to be reliable so that when we say we're going to do something, we're able to do it. Wendy says there are also situations where we know it is not a good relationship, but the individuals involved don't want to separate and want to be housed together, which makes it super challenging to know what's right to do. That's absolutely true. One thing that the domestic violence profession and the housing profession have in common is that we really believe in people's autonomy and their right to make choices and respect what they want, even when we see the challenges or the potential risks in doing so. That's really smart. And Deanna also said, difficult to stay in contact. Gosh, that's so true. Often they're going to other places to call us, so they're unreliable, and being compassionate and ready on their terms is super important. So it's really difficult to keep in contact with folks when there's any sort of challenge. Gosh, people change their phone numbers, they move around. And it's also true that if someone is sort of reaching out to you in a way that they don't want their partner to know that they are, it's going to be exponentially more difficult to stay in contact. The other thing that came up in the survey is that lots of you are aware of the intersection between housing insecurity, domestic violence, and substance use disorders, mental health conditions, sexual assault, trafficking, marginalized identities and oppression, sexism, racism, all that stuff, right? So it makes we have to consider both the batterer-generated risks, the risks of the relationship itself, as well as life-generated risks. The reality that when someone separates from a partner where they're financially intertwined, it's very, very likely that you're going to suffer some financial repercussions from separating. That is the truth. Thank you all for your contributions. So in order to provide effective support, oh, we got one more, Lisa said. The survivor is the head of the household and holds the lease, but the person causing the harm shows up as an off-lease live-in. Oh gosh, doesn't that happen a lot? Due to economic control, helping to support the child or children, survivor doesn't want to put him on the lease, but needs him to help with the kids. He pressures her to let him stay with her. Off-lease abuser puts housing stability in jeopardy. Gosh, that is so common. It is common that even when the survivor doesn't need their partner financially, they often need them for childcare, for transportation, and of course, emotionally, they may not be ready to be apart. So very smart. Thank you, Lisa. So providing effective support really requires that we believe that people can make the safest decisions for themselves, and that we can't possibly know what the safest thing is for them. It is important, in my opinion, that we focus on safety and we think about risk and we tell people the truth about what might happen, because ultimately we all believe that people have a right to make decisions for themselves. What I said earlier about autonomy, respecting folks' choices, it's really important that we really don't judge what people's choice and how they live their lives are. So we want to validate the experiences, though, and acknowledge that it's a dangerous situation and then it's a tough spot for them to be. We are going to talk about what the options are for formal domestic violence services, but really some of the options can be to stay in the relationship. And that's another thing that frequently happens. People don't want to stay in touch with us because they don't necessarily want to admit that they're staying in the relationship. So I believe it's really important that we stay clear that the people that we support deserve our support, even if they are staying in a relationship that we think is dangerous or that they acknowledge is dangerous. So it's important that we say that you deserve support in the way that you want to be supported, and that it doesn't change if you stay in the relationship. We want to acknowledge that folks have survived and that they do have lots of strengths. After doing this work for so long, you can see that so many folks are very resilient and are very creative in figuring out how to survive. And the last point on this slide is about confidentiality. If you have any limits to your confidentiality, if you need to make reports, if you suspect child abuse, please say so. Folks appreciate the ability to decide what to disclose if they have the information. And it's really important that they know if you're a confidential advocate and can keep information confidential. And that warning should be given early and often. Because really one of the things that folks are afraid of is losing their children, right? That was also acknowledged in the survey, that it would be helpful if we could assure that children are not removed because of the violence in the home, but we can't assure folks of that. We know that CPS may find the home to be too dangerous for the children to remain, and that reports can be made. If I report that my partner has physically abused me, the police may notify CPS, and that investigation may reveal that the children cannot stay in my home. So we should never lie to folks about that possibility and that potential. So I'm asking you to take a really close look at your personal biases, because even if you say all of the right things, if you have judgments, if you have biases, they're going to shine through and folks are going to pick up on it. Part of the way that folks survive is by being able to read people, and they're going to be able to read you. We do all swim in the water of victim blaming. We all believe that we all have been taught that folks should be able to just manage their own stuff, right? And that if they don't, it's their fault. And that mothers are to blame if kids aren't well taken care of, that fathers aren't around and playing an equal role in parenting. And then many of us have our own experiences, whether we've witnessed abuse, we've got someone close to us who has been abused, or if we saw it or experienced it as a child or as an adult. Like, that experience adds to the whole mix of how we react. Very often, our judgment is to help manage our own fear, because we are afraid that the person is at critical risk of being harmed or killed. And it's our way of managing our fear and separating from that. And it will burn you out. If you have your own history that you haven't worked through, you will burn out. Secondary trauma is also very real, regardless of your own history. And we need to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves as we do this work. And that applies to all of the work that all of y'all do. So as I said earlier, survivors act on what they believe is the safest course of action. It's continually changing. So what might look to you like a survivor has just given up and decided to, let the abuser have all the control, is really maybe a strategy for staying safe. So returning to a relationship where there's been violence might actually be a strategy to stay safe if the separation violence is intense, if the survivor is very nervous that the abuser is not okay and that is not safe for them. We know that folks who are not doing well are more dangerous. So returning to that relationship to take care of the partner may actually make it more safe for them. Abusers try to manipulate all of us. Very often they are skilled at getting someone on their side, whether their strategy is to make us question the survivor or think that there's something wrong with the survivor because their partner is so concerned about their mental instability, about their bad choices, and they try to get us on their side against the survivor. Survivors will pick up on your falling for that narrative, and I mentioned earlier that some abusers have lots of advantages that tips the balance of power in their favor too. So when you're talking to someone who is disclosing abuse to you, I know that all of us need to keep notes. We need to keep a record of the services we provide, but as much as you can, give your full attention and be emotionally present to the person who's talking with you. Listen deeply, and in particular, be aware of your own stereotypical beliefs that might contribute to being less effective. So if you do learn that the survivor is talking with or having contact with the person who harmed them, particularly if there is some order in place, maybe there's a no contact order through probation or through the criminal legal system, or they filed a restraining order, understand that having contact despite that order may be a safety strategy, as I mentioned earlier. Don't diagnose or prescribe solutions. If we say that we know what's best for the survivor when they disclose to us details about the abuse, then really we're taking over that power position from the abuser. And our strategy should be to support the survivor in the way that they want to be supported. Don't talk about what's wrong with families experiencing abuse with coworkers. That approach is going to definitely be felt by the people that we serve. Also remember that it's a very complicated equation to think about what's the chicken and what's the egg when there are financial difficulties, when there are mental health and substance use disorder difficulties, when folks who have behavioral health issues. Which came first, the abuse or the related issue? They're very, very complicated. Sometimes folks use substances to cope with the abuse. Sometimes someone who is wanting to be the controller of a relationship chooses someone who is more easily manipulated and who has a substance use disorder. So it's a chicken and egg kind of thing, and very, very often the past traumas contribute to that, as well as the ongoing current trauma of abuse. Being non-judgmental also means to treat folks with respect and dignity and as equals and not less than us. So again, if you're identifying too strongly with any one family member and you're a survivor of abuse as a child, an adult, or as a witness, pay attention to that and do your own work. You may struggle with too much empathy or judgments on either extreme of the spectrum. You need to trust folks and trust the process and not try to rescue folks. So safety strategies can increase risk. So leaving a violent relationship can actually make it more dangerous, as we've said earlier. Don't pry and ask for details that you really don't need to know in order to provide support. Listen carefully and take care of yourself. If you take away one message today, it's that we want to support folks in the way that they want to be supported, and that we don't tell them how to fix it or tell them what they should do. We can't possibly know the right thing to do, and we really need to believe that survivors will do their best to choose what's best for them. No one ever made a difficult change because someone told them what to do. So the other thing that's true is very many of you are going to also be providing services to those that are causing harm. And while it's important to be direct and say that it's not okay to be violent, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be treating folks with respect and dignity. We need to also know that change happens when folks are held accountable in a loving way, and that there are things that are more likely to make someone causing harm stop and want to change that behavior, right? So we did a study, gosh, more than 20 years ago now, about what made folks who were in batterer intervention programs more likely to move along the stages of change and be ready to change that behavior. And we learned that there were three things. Being arrested did matter, although repeatedly being arrested over time lost its impact. We also learned that if they understood that their children were being negatively affected by the abuse, they were more ready to change that behavior. And the third thing is if it wasn't a secret anymore. If folks knew about their abuse, it made a difference in wanting to change the abuse. All right, so probably all of you have some sort of go-to phrase. One of the things that I often use is, "I'm really sorry this happened to you," right? It's saying, "I hear you, I see you, And holding space can be really tough, but it acknowledges that I see what's going on. I believe you is really important, since there is not only victim blaming messages in our society, but there's also a tendency not to believe someone who discloses that they've been abused, especially if there's a delayed report, or if they haven't done the right things, or, and I said that in quotes if you're not watching, if they haven't called the police, if they haven't filed a restraining order, if they haven't documented the abuse, there's a tendency to disbelieve them. And sometimes in the courts, when someone brings up abuse, there's suspicion that they're bringing it up for a reason that's not truthful, that they're saying their partner was abusive because they think it will give them an advantage in, for instance, a child custody battle. None of that's true, by the way. But talking about it's not your fault, you don't deserve this, how can I help? How can I be ready for you, as we were talking earlier in the chat? And how can I support you? And what is the way that you want me to support you? So we're going to have another discussion. What are the pros and cons, the risks and benefits of reporting abuse to the police? Is this an easy thing to do? Why should somebody report? Why should they not report? Can we have a little discussion about that, either in the chat or unmute yourself? What are some of the risks? Yes, Deanna said the hardest thing to decide is when to report. Is the survivor ready to make a report? Sometimes survivors report in the moment because the situation is so dangerous, they need to interrupt it, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that they want to testify in a criminal legal court about what happened to them. Also, great point, Deanna. Will someone be killed or injured? Will the report actually escalate the violence? Will the intervention backfire and escalate the violence? And because we do know that those who cause harm in relationships can get to the point where nothing matters. Everybody knows about it. It's no longer a protective factor, and they're just determined to retaliate or punish the person they've been harming, right? Anybody else have thoughts about reporting and the benefits or the risks of reporting? It's a teeter-totter. Yep, it's a delicate balance. And the survivor is deciding, can I report? Should I report? Is this a good thing? Is it going to get me hurt or killed? Is it going to result in, what are some of the other bad things that can happen if the police are called? Maybe the abuser leaves. Maybe the person who committed the domestic violence crime can't be arrested, and now they're really raging mad, right? Now they want to punish their partner for having made that report. What's another risk of reporting? Retaliation, for sure, against the children or the pets or family members. That could also be a motivator for the survivor to protect the people that they love. Afraid they might be evicted, absolutely. Afraid that CPS might be called. I've heard some very, very explicit, very scary threats that partners have made about how I'm going to kill your whole family, I'm going to find your parents. And when you've been in a relationship with someone, you do know where friends and family live. There isn't a whole lot of places that you know about, or people that you know about that your partner doesn't know about. So when your lives are intertwined like that, it's difficult to think about untangling them and keeping everyone safe, right? Also would make the member more afraid to leave next time and more afraid to report. Absolutely. One of the purposes of escalating the violence when there's a report is that I'm going to prevent you from ever reporting again. I'm going to make your life so scary and so risky that you're never going to report again. Thanks for that. Why might they be evicted if I call the police? If I call the police because I'm being hurt, can I really be evicted? Of course you can. Right. Of course you can. Because you may not, and it also will make you unpopular with the landlord. It's going to make you seem like the problem tenant if you're always calling the police, right? And you may not want to disclose what the real reason is, particularly if you're doing it to interrupt the violence, and then you don't necessarily tell the police what really happened. Absolutely. Lots of reasons. All right, so let's look at what it looks like to get the system involved. So this is the next couple of slides were created by Praxis International in Minnesota. They've named this survivor Rachel. This is Rachel and her 2 kids. And I've adapted it to reflect our systems in Milwaukee. So someone might seek services by calling the hotline or walking into the Family Peace Center and seek services from Sojourner or any of the partners in the building. It might also start by a parent bringing the child for children's programming to the Milwaukee Child Advocacy Center appointment or to Children's of Wisconsin psychiatry. So it might be the survivor or their children getting services that initiates the first contact. Oh, this is hard to see. I hope you can see this. So it might also be that someone files for a temporary restraining order, either using Sojourner or now they can file electronically without any support. And there's also several other agencies in Milwaukee who can help someone file a restraining order. It's called e-filing. And it's a pretty complicated process, especially for someone who's not comfortable using the computer, doesn't have a computer, may not have an email. So the court then reviews that, decides whether to issue the temporary order. There may be some legal representation from Legal Action or another lawyer, and then there's a final hearing. So that happens very frequently. That we're still seeing about 4,000 people a year filing a restraining order. So it might very frequently, the way that folks get involved is a call to the police. There are thousands of calls to the police, usually through 911. There can be an arrest or a warrant issued. The district attorney's office reviews it for charges and makes a decision whether or not to press charges. There's a whole criminal court process, and it can end up in a trial ultimately, or a plea. So another way that people enter this journey is through a report of child abuse or neglect and through CPS and that whole system and its complicated facets. It's also, you guys talked about eviction. Sometimes the landlord gets a complaint or the rent is late because of the financial circumstances of the family. It may end up in an eviction. Another system that many folks are involved with is family court, whether it's a divorce action or a paternity action, temporary orders, child support, family support, who gets what property, and that process can take a very long time. Very frequently, these systems are happening simultaneously. So I know that many survivors are confused about who's doing what. And they know they've got a caseworker, and they know they've got a housing worker, and they know they've got a domestic violence advocate. And it's really hard to keep those systems straight. And sometimes they're all happening at once. So when we talk about where to get support, as I mentioned earlier, there are domestic violence agencies, professional agencies, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't also encourage folks to talk to friends or family who might be able to support them in the way that they want to be supported. People who understand their situation, who don't blame them, who are supportive and non-judgmental. There may also be resources through school or work or through a faith community. And again, you're hearing me say support them in the way they want to be supported and who understand their situation and don't make judgments or otherwise be unavailable to the survivor. The domestic violence agencies include culturally specific programs. And there was a bunch of questions in the survey about who serves LGBTQ folks, who serves folks in a culturally specific way. So we're going to look at that. But when you're making a referral, consider how the survivor identifies when you're discussing options. And don't assume that the survivor you're talking to, oh gosh, well, she's Muslim, so she probably wants to go talk to the Milwaukee Muslim Women's Coalition. That's not necessarily true. It's a very tricky balance to figure out. Some survivors don't want to get support in a small community agency because they're concerned that folks will know that they're getting support or that they will know someone there, right? So you do want to talk about all of the resources that are available to survivors and what they can provide. So offer multiple options. All of the domestic violence and sexual assault agencies I'm going to talk about that get government funding are free and they do maintain confidentiality. Survivors don't have to be put into our database. They can remain anonymous if they're calling a hotline or getting services. We can keep records separate from the database for someone who doesn't want to be in the database as well. And that might be because they're afraid that their partner can hack into it, but it might also be because they have some connection with Sojourner or the partners in the building, or they otherwise need confidentiality from our system. Emphasize that being isolated and keeping abuse secret increases danger. So I haven't talked a lot about lethality except to mention that we're concerned about it and that reporting can escalate danger. One of the strategies that Milwaukee uses is the lethality assessment program, the LAP. It was created by Dr. Jackie Campbell at Johns Hopkins, and the LAP protocol has law enforcement officers asking 11 questions that predict homicide or increased risk, lethality specifically. And then the officers, when someone screens in as high risk for lethality, they have a script that goes something like, people in your situation have been hurt or killed, and I'd really like you to talk to someone who can support you around figuring out safety. So if officers are using that, prosecutors are using that, and advocates are using that, the message in Dr. Campbell's research then is more effective at intervention, and talking to someone is a protective factor. So what she found in her research is that people who are connected with someone who can support them survive at greater rates. So I'm telling you that because as you're talking about encouraging someone to connect to someone who can provide support to them, I want you to know that you can be talking about that is something that might be a protective factor and might make it less likely that they'll be killed. So the two emergency domestic violence shelters, I think you're all aware, are Sojourner and Community Advocates, who runs the Milwaukee Women's Center, and also has the Older Abused Women's Program. all of the resources I'm going to go through are going to be on a handout that I'll send out through Claire. So in addition to our shelter and crisis hotline, we also have a text line we started so that folks who want to reach out but don't have the privacy to do so to make a call, or who prefer to text, can text us. The restraining order clinic I mentioned earlier, we can help people electronically file restraining orders, and we have appointments that folks can sign up for online and get on a wait list, in addition to calling us for folks who don't have access to that. So those are the emergency domestic violence shelter programs. There are 2 agencies that provide LGBTQ specific support in Milwaukee. They provide support for domestic abuse survivors, sexual assault survivors, and hate crime survivors. And that is the Milwaukee LGBT Community Center's anti-violence program. And Diverse and Resilient has a warm line. It's called Room to Be Safe, and they operate in Milwaukee and in Appleton. Diverse and Resilient is also considered one of our culturally specific agencies because of their approach to support and its cultural specificity. So during the pandemic, very early on, Milwaukee County helped fund a website called weareheremke.org for the culturally specific agencies to get the message out that they are still open and available. Those agencies include Gerald Ignace and her Wellness Institute, both serving Native American populations, the Milwaukee Muslim Women's Coalition, which I mentioned earlier, and the ASHA Project, which is the oldest culturally specific agency in Milwaukee, serving African American families, the Hmong American Women's Association, and the hotline at the Hmong Family Strengthening Hotline after hours, and UMOS's Latina Resource Center, which also runs a hotline 24 hours a day. So I think the next slide is, yes, that's a picture of the website, the We Are Here MKE website. And there's a drop down with all of the agencies that are listed. If you click on any of those agencies, you'll hear more about what services they provide, how to connect with them, the population that they focus on, and the services that they provide to that population, in addition to some statistics about their target population. So I also want to remind you that very often what folks are experiencing that we're serving is also sexual violence, and that Aurora has support programs at the Healing Center, but also crisis services at the Healing and Advocacy Services. It used to be called the Sexual Assault Treatment Center, if you've been around for a minute. They do have a 24-hour hotline, and they have text and chat during business hours. And I think you probably all know that there are some human trafficking organizations, and you can contact me for more information about that. The listing of partners on that website is outdated. There are some statewide resources, including one for deaf survivors and Unidos for Spanish-speaking survivors. And then there's national resources, including chats through the Strong Heart Native Helpline and the Domestic Violence Hotline. I'm also including in this list the National Immigrant Family Violence Institute, because it has safety plans in multiple languages. It's a great resource. I found it when I was looking for something in Swahili. And then there's youth-specific support at Pathfinders and Walker's Point. I think you all know them. There are some sites, both Wisconsin youth-led site and a national site. All right, and let's look at Sojourner. So this is the shelter. It's looking down the hallway from the hotline. There are family rooms on either side, some of which have adjoining doors. At the end of the hallway, it turns right, and there are some single and double rooms. That is looking into a room which probably has one less bed in it now. We have removed some of the furniture for social distancing purposes. That is the best view of the city from the Family Peace Center. It's the dining room called the Hub. And then there's a little cafe outside and a sitting room. We have advocates who help with restraining orders, as I mentioned before. We also have advocates in all of the police districts in Milwaukee. We have advocates who speak with folks after they've met with the district attorney's office or come to the Family Peace Center. Our Hope and Healing program is support groups and ongoing support, and we also do all of it in Russian. We've got a children's program that meets at the same time as adult programming when we're in person. We've had to adjust during the pandemic, and we did still take kids on overnight camp called Camp Hope. And we have increased our arts and music programming to attract families and children in healing spaces. We have not started support groups back up in person yet. Lots of folks are still really nervous about in-person support groups. That's our children's space. Outside those windows are the playground that you saw from the bedroom. And then, as I mentioned earlier, on site, we also have Children's of Wisconsin has 4 programs on site besides the Child Advocacy Center. There's also Child Psychiatry, Project Ujima, and Community Services. Aurora Healing and Advocacy Services, while its main campus is at Sinai. And they also have services at West Dallas. They have an office at the Family Peace Center. Coral Centro's main office is on Bruce Street, but they also have an outpost at the Family Peace Center. They provide non-traditional healing methods, including acupuncture and massage. It's really popular both for care providers and for clients. Goodwill does financial literacy and employment readiness support. Jewish Family Services provides therapy to adults. Legal Action does legal services, representation, advice in various matters. And then we've got our public partners on site also. The Milwaukee County District Attorney's Office has their prosecutors that review intimate partner violence and sexual assault cases on site. Milwaukee Police Department has their Sensitive Crimes Division on site. MPS has somebody from the social work department to help help parents navigate school systems. And Wraparound Milwaukee is mental health treatment for children. It's an insurance program. So if you go to the Family Peace Center website, which is Sojourner's website, there is in the About section, the Family Peace Center in the drop down. And if you open that, you'll see the collage of all the logos for the on-site partners. And if you click on one, you'll get a voiceover and pictures of that partner's space.